Good morning. The committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, the Committee on the Science and Technology meets to consider the following measure. H.R. 1516, the American Competes Reauthorization Act of 2010. We will now proceed with the markup. On October the 12th, 2005, in response to a bipartisan request by this committee and our colleagues in the Senate, the National Academies announced the report Rising Above the Gathering Storm. The distinguished panel, led by Norm Augustine, painted a very scary picture and told us that without action, the future was bleak for our children and our grandchildren. This report was, without question, a call to arms. So this committee moved forward by turning the Gathering Storm recommendation into legislative language. The final result was the enactment of the American Competes Act of 2007 with a bipartisan support of 367 members. Moreover, with the leadership of Senators Alexander and Bingham and 69 co-sponsors, the Senate approved the conference report by unanimous consent. And I told Senator Alexander the other day that if he does this once again by unanimous consent in the Senate, that I'm nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize as well as special envoy to the Middle East. Now, after 3 years, we are back to work on the reauthorization of Competes. Since the enactment of Competes, the committee has held 48 hearings on areas addressed in the bill before us today. The subcommittees, through bipartisan process, have brought to the full committee a strong body of work, and I would like to thank our subcommittee chairs and ranking members for their stewardship of the matters in each of their jurisdiction. I also would like to especially thank the majority and minority staffs for the many, many hours of thoughtful work they have committed, and all the good advice we've received from members on and off the committee, as well as others interested in the outside parties. And honestly, this bill is a big deal, and it's important. It's a big deal and important for our country and for the committee's stature in Congress. It's a big deal and important step in leading our innovation agenda. It's a big deal and important for the business community, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the Business Roundtable, which is why they have been so supportive. It's a big deal and important for our universities and our national labs. And it's a big deal and important for our children and grandchildren, so they are not the first generation of Americans to inherit a standard of living lower than the parents. The statistics speak for themselves. More than 50% of our economic growth since World War II can be directly attributed to investments in research. The path is simple. Research leads to innovation. Innovation leads to economic development and good-paying jobs. And even before the price of oil hit record heights, Gathering Storm recommended greater energy independence. But we must move to a cleaner, more efficient, and more balanced energy portfolio. We should not trade our dependency on foreign oil for a dependency on foreign technology. And that's why ARPA-E is important. Now, throughout this process, there has been a lot of legitimate discussions about federal deficits. And I agree that we must address the challenges presented by our deficits, but we also must invest in our country's future. I remember Newt Gingrich saying that one of his greatest regrets was not doubling the funding for the National Science Foundation when he put NIH on a path to doubling. In the manager's amendment I will offer today, we will maintain a doubling path for our research accounts over the next 10 years, but on a slightly less steep trajectory. Matter of fact, we will be cutting 10% off the original request. So now, if I were responsible for writing this bill myself, it would look somewhat different than the bill we are going to consider today. But that's a good thing. There have been a sincere effort to be inclusive, to work with members on both sides of the aisle, and to develop a bill that is truly a committee work product. I believe this is a good bill, both on substance and on process, and it's a better bill because of the contribution of all of our members. Ms. Johnson, Ms. Edwards, Ms. Fudge, and Mr. Lujan have improved the bill through efforts on diversity and broadening participation. Dr. Ehlers has helped perfect the definitions of the Office of Science. Mr. Smith has helped ensure that standards development throughout NIST remain voluntary for businesses and industry. Mr. Gerimondi has helped ensure that the findings of the Fusion Energy Report make their way into the Department of Energy's planning. These are just a few examples of the amendments that have improved our product without mentioning the hours and hours of staff discussion and the countless changes made during the past month and a half. Competes is truly and will continue to be a bipartisan, bicameral effort that everyone on this committee can feel full ownership of and should take bragging rights on. And finally, let me say that more than 50 years ago, when DARPA was first created, they had no idea that the research they would fund would be responsible for the creation of the Internet or proliferation of GPS technology, but it did. And those inventions started with federal dollars, as well as countless other game-changing technologies. And I really believe in the next 30 years, when most of us are gone from Congress, and when this committee is working on the 5th or 6th reauthorization of the American Competes Act, then I'm confident that my good friend, Mr. Hall, will regale us or regale everyone that's left with stories about our efforts today and how we got our innovative spirit back on track and breakthroughs that ensued. Now I recognize Mr. Hall to present his opening remarks.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for full committee markup of America Competes. And of course, our nation's ability to compete in the global marketplace depends on many, many factors. Witnesses who have appeared before our committee this past year and other years have stressed the need for lower taxes, streamlined federal regulations, a reduced national debt, and greater market choice to remain competitive. Investments in basic science, research and development also spur long-term growth and are of particular interest to our committee, and I know they're of particular interest to this chairman. It's not surprising that the National Academy's report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, and President Bush's American Competitiveness Initiative focused on these types of scientific investments. In 2007, our committee also responded by passing the America Competes Bill, which was a 3-year authorization that placed 3 agencies, National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the Office of Science at the Department of Energy, on a 10-year doubling path. The bill before us today reauthorizes these agencies for 5 years at a cost of over $93 billion. It establishes 7 new programs and initiatives, including energy innovation hubs at DOE, a loan guarantee program at the Department of Commerce, regional innovation clusters at the Department of Commerce, and a new user facility at NIST. The concern that I have is that some of these new programs are potentially duplicative of current efforts and divert funding away from basic science research and development. They also increase the cost of the bill by billions. I remain committed to investing in basic science research and development, but I'm also mindful of our current dire economic situation. The percentage of our nation's debt is now greater than the percentage of our gross domestic product, and our nation's budget deficit has increased 50% since the last authorization of this bill 3 years ago. These numbers are truly unsustainable and threaten America's ability to compete globally. As stewards of the taxpayers' dollars during these times, we need to be even more vigilant with how we allocate our resources. During the subcommittee markups, Republican members offered good amendments to, among other things, shorten the length of authorization from 5 years to 3 years to ensure proper oversight, strike new and potentially duplicative programs, and clarify the mission and direction of programs. While these did not pass at subcommittee level, several members today will be offering similar amendments, in addition to others, in an attempt to continue the goals outlined in Rising Above the Gathering Storm while protecting taxpayers against potential waste and ballooning deficits. I'm hopeful that they'll get a favorable reception today. I'd like to thank the chairman and his staff for working with me and working with the Republican staff throughout the process. As I've said before, and as I believe today, I've enjoyed working with you over the years and will really and truly miss your presence in Congress, your leadership, and your friendship after retirement this next year. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Baird is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, solely for the purpose of lamenting your absence at the Capitol Challenge this morning. As many of my colleagues know, Chairman Gordon set an impressive record of 20 consecutive wins in 20 years, unparalleled and surely be unrepeated. And we missed you this morning, but I'm proud to say Dan Lipinski from this committee finished second behind a gentleman about half his age. So, Mr. Chairman, America competes, and so does the chairman of this committee, and we're very proud of you.
Thank you, Mr. Baird. You can see the importance I put on this legislation to be here today and break a 20-year streak. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? If not, we will move forward. I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was noticed along with the bill, be treated as original text for the purpose of amendment, and that the amendment and the reading of the amendment in the nature of a substitute be dispensed with, and that the members proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, reserving the right to object, and I probably will not object if this conversation goes well. I'd like to ask the chairman to confirm for me today's full committee markup process of H.R. 5116. Mr. Chairman, you're requesting unanimous consent to waive the reading of the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
That is correct.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Further, we're also to consider a manager's amendment today, which will be first on the roster.
That is correct.
The official markup notice requested members draft their amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. However, by circulating a manager's amendment last evening, some members were forced to redraft their amendments. This is the second time in a week for this type of situation. However, the chairman acknowledged this additional step in the process, which we greatly appreciate. I thank you, and we worked hard to meet the amendment deadline. Mr. Chairman, will these amendments drafted, the manager's amendment, go first on the roster?
Yes, sir.
Is it the chairman's intention that members be able to offer amendments not included on the roster, including those to the manager's amendment and the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
If additional amendments are offered, yes, sir.
In the case of a member not being present to offer his or her amendment listed on the roster, is it the chairman's intention that the amendment may be offered by another member or may be offered by the member when the member returns, but at the end of the roster?
That's correct.
I thank the chairman for reviewing the process for today, and I withdraw my reservation.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Let me just so everyone knows our process today. We do have a lot of amendments. We're going to be approaching 60, but they are all reasonable amendments, and they deserve to have consideration. I'm expecting that we're going to have votes around noon, and so I doubt that we'll be through by noon. So we will, at that time, we will notice when we'll get started again. It will be shortly thereafter. We have pizza that will be available on a bipartisan basis. Well, maybe, but we'll see how Dr. Brown is acting. He may have to get a permit, but it'll be in the chairman's office that we will have pizza. There'll probably be additional votes, a series around maybe 1:30 or 2, and then we will be in session until 7. My hope is that we'll be through long before 7, but if not, we will proceed till we complete the bill and everybody has a chance to say what they want to say.
Mr. Chairman, will the minority have a right to have a part in the decision of what goes on those pizzas with the toppings?
You will have a third of the pizza.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, Dr. Brown.
I ask unanimous consent that I may have a permit for the pizza.
Without objection.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We better have a quick gavel on that one. Okay, so without further objection, or without objection, so ordered. The First Amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment offered by the chair. The chair will report, or the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 041, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. The manager's amendment I offer makes several technical and minor changes to the base text. The most significant part of the amendment is changes to many of the bill's authorization levels. During the subcommittee process, several amendments were offered to reduce the authorization level in the bill. At the first markup in the Energy and Environment Subcommittee, Ms. Biggert had an amendment that she withdrew on my commitment to address the authorization levels at full committee. I appreciate the patience of the members and willingness to work with us to address this in a holistic way. Overall, the funding changes in the amendment will reduce authorization levels in this bill by just over 10%. We maintain a 10-year doubling path by growing the authorization for each agency at approximately 7% annually. The funding path provides a modest cushion above the President's request in the event our deficits come down and more funds are available. And at the same time, we provide a stable, sustainable, and achievable set of authorization levels across the agencies. These levels are lower than I would like them to be, but I believe they are practical. Considering our current budget deficits, at a time of flat discretionary budgets, a 7% growth rate for continued progress in getting our research programs back on path to be the best in the world, I think is a good investment in our children's future. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Hall is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By reducing the authorization funding levels, the manager's amendment moves the bill, I think, in the right direction. It also addresses some of the members' concerns. I appreciate the gentleman's continued willingness to work with our side to improve this bill. Unfortunately, I'm a little disappointed to see that you've removed the language that we both worked so diligently on to have placed in the 2007 version of Competes regarding the Noyce Scholarship Program. It was taken out in conference, and I appreciate you including it in the underlying measure before us today. I know you and I both agree that we want to see all of our students reap the benefits of having the best math and science teachers we can possibly get. We recognize the unique challenges of, quote, high-need schools, unquote, in the underlying bill by providing an additional incentive for these new trained teachers to be there. But we also allowed flexibility for them to teach in any school. I'm just wondering why that provision is being removed in this amendment. Regardless, it's my hope that we can further improve the bill moving forward today. Even after factoring in the lower authorization numbers in the management's amendment, the bill still calls for billions in new spending. I thank the chairman. I yield back my time.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Ms. Biggert is recognized.
I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for working on the authorization. I will just take a minute to say thank you. I think that this, in this economic times, this is very important that we try and get by on the amount that is needed. But I do think, as we've talked about, physical science, that this is a very important bill. And thank you for all the work that you've done on it. And I think that the authorization really helps to be fiscally responsible, and I appreciate you working with me, and I yield back.
Well, I will say to the gentlelady, again, in a perfect world, you and I would like to see even more investment in these areas and think it is a good investment. We try to be sensitive to the fact that, again, these are difficult times, and we wanted to try to make, again, a 10% reduction, I think, is a pretty significant reduction over the original proposal. Let me also say that you will find at your desk a list of endorsements. These are just a few of the first endorsements that are coming in. There are literally going to be hundreds of endorsements before this bill is over with. The National Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, the Business Roundtable, the entire university and research community. Again, I think they recognize the benefit of this, and I think some of them also had the same concerns you did, and that's why we tried to address them, and I thank you for that. Okay, the next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Brown. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 172, amendment offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia to the amendment offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have this amendment that I was very pleased to hear the chairman say he's concerned about our children's future, and this is just a common sense amendment that will help ensure our children's economic future, I believe. This amendment would help our committee conduct more effective oversight and financial stewardship over the entire Competes program. It simply keeps intact the first 3 years of authorized spending at the fiscal year 2010 appropriations level through FY 2013 for NSF, NIST, the Office of Science, and ARPA-AE sections in the Manager's Amendment, but it strikes out the two-year funding levels for FY 2014 and 2015. It will reduce authorized spending by over $45 billion. $8.2 billion will be reduced in the first 3 years by extending the FY 2010 base levels, and $37 billion will be saved by striking out the last 2 years. The 3-year authorization level is consistent with the original 2007 Competes authorization. And with that authorization, we found plenty to change. According to the CBO, the President's budget raises the deficit to $1.5 trillion in 2010, and our debt held by the public is ever growing, as well as is unsustainable. Additionally, this reauthorization goes beyond the President's request. At an economic time such as now, why do we need to extend the Competes authorization to 5 years? The fiscally responsible course to follow for our committee is to keep these sections in the reauthorization at the 2010 appropriated level and at a 3-year authorization timeline. At the end of 3 years or beforehand, our committee can always come back to the drawing board and assess how these agencies are living up to their commitments. I urge the committee to support this amendment by keeping the authorized funding at the 2010 appropriated levels for those sections that we've listed in this amendment, and by reducing the authorization timeline to 3 years so that we can have the opportunity to better review the entire Competes program at that time.
Yeah, that's all I got.
Mr. Chairman, I have a reference chart that I would ask unanimous consent to be entered in the record at this point.
If gentleman concludes.
I just asked unanimous, yes, I yield back for unanimous consent request to put the reference chart.
Certainly, without objection.
At this point. Mr. Chairman, we do need to have innovation. We do need to have a reauthorization. But our children's future really is dependent upon not only research and development from the science and technology perspective, but also in the area of fiscal responsibility. And this committee has an opportunity with this amendment to show fiscal responsibility to the American public, and it's absolutely time that we do that. It's past time that we do that. And I just hope that the chairman and my Democratic colleagues will support this amendment. It's a common sense amendment. It doesn't stop the research and development. It is a fiscally conservative, common sense amendment. And the simple truth is we drastically need it for our children and grandchildren's future. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I thank the chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, and the chairman yields to himself. Certainly, I think we all agree at this podium that we need to be fiscally responsible, but we also have to invest in our future in those areas that need to be. As was mentioned earlier, we make a 10% reduction in the original authorization level. I think that shows good faith in moving that direction. But changing an authorization from 5 years to 3 years really doesn't save money. You've got the same amount being spent in those first 3 years. So I think we really need the 5 years to have consistency with research. The original Competes was authorized for 3 years, and the reason for that is it was a new bill. And so we felt that it needed a shorter period of time. But I think now we need to get into the continuity. I think that this committee, and I'm sure, will continue with oversight over these next 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 years. And if there need to be changes, that can be made at that time. But I think it would be a false savings to just move a 5-year bill to a 3-year bill. Now,
Mr. Chairman,
I yield my time to Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By cutting it to 3 years, it doesn't stop this committee from coming back and going back to the drawing board. Also, this amendment does reduce the spending because it reduces it down to FY 2010 levels, so it does actually save money for and does help preserve our children and grandchildren's future. So I agree with the chairman. We do need to have innovation. We do need to have the research and development. This amendment will not stop those from going forward. And I, as a scientist, believe very firmly in research and development and believe in these programs, but it will cut spending if this amendment is adopted. It will help preserve our children and grandchildren's future, and it doesn't stop this committee from coming back. But most importantly, I think this helps us with the oversight, and it will give us the ability to have more oversight on this, and so that we have these entities in the federal government come back to this committee and help us to have a greater watchful eye over what's going on there. And so it is for the oversight as well as for the reduced spending that I offer this amendment. I thank the chairman for yielding.
Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Dr. Brown. I thank you too, and I thank Dr. Brown for offering this amendment and point out how dramatically our fiscal situation has changed since we originally passed this bill. In 2007, when the committee first passed Competes, the federal budget deficit was projected at $160 billion, and the national debt was $8 trillion. And this year, the deficit is projected to be almost $1.6 trillion, 10 times higher, and the national debt's over $12 trillion, a 50% increase in less than 3 years. We simply can't continue to spend as if we aren't in a budget crisis. This amendment recognizes that, and I thank Dr. Brown for offering it. I yield back my time.
Dr. Baird's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just make two points. First of all, at the end of the Clinton administration, there was a $200 billion plus surplus in the federal budget. By the end of the Bush administration, there was a $1.3 trillion deficit. The national debt had doubled. Our dependency on foreign borrowing had doubled, and that includes countries like China that are not our best friends. Many of my colleagues on the other side voted repeatedly for budgets that did not fully fund the war, voted for tax cuts that were not paid for, and so I applaud them for at long last caring about the deficit. The problem here, however, is that this resolution actually undermines science and doesn't in fact save any money. It won't save money, and it's not fiscally responsible for two reasons. First of all, we are going to continue the National Science Foundation funding unless the gentleman is proposing we actually terminate it. There's nothing in this amendment, and there's nothing that can prevent any future Congress from looking at, with full oversight, the NSF as they ought to do, and all the other, the NIST, NSF, ARPA-E. We ought to do that on an annual basis, and in fact we do as responsible chairs. So this is largely a specious amendment, I'm sorry to say, and it won't save any money, but it will undermine science if it were to pass. And the reason for that is scientific research. As a scientist who has actually published in international scientific journals myself, scientific research sometimes takes several years to complete, and it takes several years to plan, and if you have uncertainty about whether the funding will be there, you can't pursue those avenues of research. So in fact, what would happen if we did this was we would actually weaken the scientific endeavor, reduce America's competitiveness, which is the antithesis of the intent of this bill, and undermine the fundamental premise of the Blue Ribbon panel that wrote Rising Above the Gathering Storm. So I don't plan to make those points too many more times, because I think they ought to surface as a basis for a future discussion when these deficit arguments arise and amendments that purport to reduce the deficit are offered that in fact would not reduce the deficit one iota, but would in fact undermine our scientific mission. I'll yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm sorry, Mr. Brown, I already yielded back.
Who was it that asked for time? They can. Dr. Brown, you can have your own time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Baird, I've been a great critic of our president and our Congress creating the large debt that has been created. And as the gentleman from Washington knows, I wasn't here to vote on all those bills, and I think it was wrong. But it does not matter what happened in the past. We must deal with the future. And the deficit is at $1.6 trillion currently. And we, if we had an unlimited amount of funds, there are a lot of great things that could be done. But as families look to balance their budget, as small businesses and large businesses look at trying to have a balanced budget within their businesses, as my own state of Georgia has to balance its budget, it's critical that the federal government balance its budget. And we're just not doing that, and continuing the spending at the level that we are growing this federal government is just unsustainable, and it is just actually, as far as I'm concerned, it's criminal, because we're stealing our children and grandchildren's future, and we've just got to stop the spending. And so there are many great things that can be done, many great things that I'd like to see done, but continuing to spend money that we don't have, borrowing money from China. We just recently had a bond auction where there weren't enough people there to bid on our bonds, and we are getting at the point where we're going to have a financial collapse of this country if we don't stop the spending. And so it's, I'm not in favor of cutting these programs. I'm just saying that we need to hold the line for a while, get us out of this economic downturn, and then we can go forward. It's time for us to put the constraints on the spending of Congress. It's past time. And I don't care whether it's Republicans or Democrats running this Congress. We've got to stop the spending. It's just stealing our children, our grandchildren's future. And I appreciate the gentleman's concern, and I appreciate his scientific inquiry and his publishing. But if we just hold the line for a while and get this economy going again by stimulating the private sector instead of stimulating government, then we can have more money to spend on further research and development. It's time to just kind of rein things in for a bit so that we can go forward. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. We'll have an opportunity to discuss this 3 or 4 more times,
Mr. Chairman?
as on these next amendments. So, if
Mr. Chairman, right here.
Dr. Bartlett.
Thank you. I'm somewhat conflicted. I'm one of only 18 in this House that voted against all of the bailout stimulus programs, and so I don't need to defend my conservative credentials. But I will tell you that, and I have more children and grandchildren than anyone else here, I think, 17 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren, and I'm really concerned about their future. And one of my concerns is that we are losing the technology battle to other countries. This year, China will graduate 7 times as many engineers as we graduate. And so, you know, I think that one of the best things that I can do for my kids and my grandkids and my great-grandkids is to make sure that we have the technology base there. By the way, if we had been doing this 20 years ago, we wouldn't have the fiscal problems we have today, because we'd be competing better. Just very sadly, just a couple of weeks ago, the last 330 manufacturers of what used to be one of the largest solar cell manufacturing companies in the world, SolarX, now BP Solar, was shut down in my district. And so I think that our kids' future is going to be better if we invest in these technologies, because we're going to then be able to compete internationally. If we don't, I have some serious concerns about our future. I don't need to defend my conservative credentials, but, you know, I think that as a true conservative, you really need to be looking for what will be best for your kids in the future, and I think expanding our technology base is what we ought to be doing.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Thank you. I'd like to attach my my remarks to those of Dr. Baird and Dr. Bartlett. For those with Dr. Baird, it would be the remarks after the political commercial. But I would agree that this is something that we have to do. And so many times and on this committee that we have always been behind other committees as far as, you know, what we need to do. Research and development is the most important thing that we can do for the innovation and creativity, and I think that we really have to move ahead and do this. If we want to improve the economy, if we want to have the jobs, this is the way to do it. And I know it's economic times, but I think I would agree that I would be opposed to this amendment. Yield back.
Sounds like a statement from a good Stanford graduate. Is there, Mr. Diaz-Barr?
I did notice that that Stanford was on the list.
Chairman, I promise to be brief. We've been discussing. I just want to support Mr. Brown's amendment. Look, you know, if we don't control our spending appetite, we're not going to have to worry about our technology advantage or our economic advantage or our military advantage. We're going to have to worry about it as much as Argentina's worrying about it or Greece is worrying about it right now. We're in a crossroads, ladies and gentlemen, where we're bankrupting the country. And we're going to have to do our part. That's a decision that we have to make, and we can always spend good money after good money or good money after bad money, but we need to start doing our part, not blaming anybody, but we need to start controlling our appetite for this spending. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If there's no further discussion on the amendment, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
Mr.
And
Chairman.
the amendment is not agreed to,
Mr.
and the
Chairman.
clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon. Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Fudge. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Garamendi.
No.
Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Rothman. No. Mr. Rothman votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Davis. No. Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan votes no. Mr. Hill. No. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. No. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Ms. Dahlkemper. Ms. Dahlkemper votes no. Mr. Grayson. No. Mr. Grayson votes no. Ms. Cosmas. No. Ms. Cosmas votes no. Mr. Peters. No. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Hall. Aye. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes present. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Ehlers votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Inglis votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Olson. Aye. Mr. Olson votes aye.
Has everyone, Mr. Miller?
Mr. Miller votes no.
Ms. Fudge?
Ms. Fudge votes no.
Is there, if there's no one, Mr. Matheson?
Mr. Matheson votes no.
If there's no one else, then the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 11 members vote aye, 24 members vote no, and 1 member vote present.
Next amendment on the roster is an amendment by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Diaz-Balart. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 023, amendment offered by Mr. Mario Diaz-Balart of Florida to the amendment offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee.
I use unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be a little bit more brief than that if possible. Look, if passed, the manager's amendment before us would authorize over $83.9 billion over 5 and 10 years. And also there's parts in the bill that says in addition to such sums, there's a lot of provisions regarding such sums. I think it's important to go over some of the spending details. And again, I must add that I do want to thank the chairman for his willingness to work with us and listen to us. But I do think it's important to kind of find out where we are. In the first year of funding of the bill, It recommends an increase of $345 million above the administration's request. Remember that the president's budget last year was $3.6 trillion with revenues of $2.4 trillion. Now, I know that a lot of people that blame that for sins of the past, and that's okay. This year, the president's budget recommendation is $3.8 trillion. Here's a problem. Revenues are $2.6 trillion. This bill goes above the president's recommended levels. Put it in perspective. ARPA-E, which was funded for the first time in the stimulus, is really a brand new program, and the bill more than triples its funding over 5 years to $1 billion, and it extends it through FY 2020 with, quote, such sums as necessary. Again, all this funding amounts to over $83.9 billion, which is $20 billion over in new funding, or 32.9% above the current baseline. So let me tell you what this amendment does. First, this amendment, very similar to what Dr. Brown was trying to do. This amendment would simply strike out the out-year fundings in the bill to make it a 3-year bill, which is consistent with the original America Competes bill, which has received so much praise. This would allow our committee to conduct more effective oversight of the entire Competes program, and then coming back in 3 years to review and consider that. Now, hopefully in 3 years, maybe the deficit has been reduced, maybe our fiscal situation is in better shape. We can see then if we need to cut money or to even increase funding for the Competes program, and we can also find out what works. All it does is it forces us to look at the issue in 3 years. But most importantly, the amendment would reduce the authorized spending in this bill by $37 billion by striking the out-year funding. The second part of the amendment still places the 3 priority agencies, the Office of Science, NIST, and the National Science Foundation, on a doubling path over 10 years using the FY 2010 appropriated levels. It doubles the appropriated levels as opposed to what the bill does. This would reduce authorized funding by $1.2 billion in 2011 through 2013. The amendment prioritizes core research at the 3 main agencies and gives them some really huge increases, I would tell you, which has obviously been a recommendation of the science and business communities. And again, we're able to then prioritize. In conclusion, this amendment would reduce the total authorization by $38.22 billion. And as Mr. Brown was saying, we can point towards the past. And Mr. Beard, who's a dear friend of mine, and I have had these discussions in the Budget Committee many times over. And we can complain about the doubling of the debt and the deficit during the last administration. That's a worthwhile complaint, and I agree with them there. But then should we triple the thing that we criticized and say it's okay? Well, here we have an opportunity to just do a small part, our part, to just say we're still going to double. We're still going to double the funding. But let's just try to make it a little bit less painful, a little bit less money on our children and our grandchildren's credit card. That's all this does. I thank the chairman for his willingness to always listen to me, and he's been extremely cooperative. But I think this is a step in the right direction. It doesn't hurt the program. It still increases funding dramatically. But it does at least show that we're willing to at least recognize that we have a serious problem and that we do not want to be the next Greece or the next Argentina. And the American people know that we're at a crossroads right now. Whether we're going to leave our country, whether our children are going to continue to live in the freest, most prosperous country, or whether we're going to change that. This is a small step in the right direction. I urge your support of the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I thank my friend from Florida, and recognize myself for 5 minutes. Again, I think that this committee made more than just a small recommendation or a small acknowledgement. By cutting the original recommendation by 10%, I think that was a significant cut, a significant recognition of the situation we're in. Obviously, the appropriators will make the final decision, and they will have the leeway to do that. So, if there's no further discussion,
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment's about prioritizing, and we simply don't have enough money to pay for everything that we want to do, so we have to prioritize. Mr. Diaz Ballard does exactly that by providing for increases to research at the 3 priority agencies identified by the committee in 2007, NSF, DOE Office of Science, and NIST, while holding ARPA-E flat. This would trim over $1 billion from the authorized levels in the first 3 years of the bill, and many more billions by striking the out-year funding. It's a good amendment. I strongly support it.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Dr. Bartlett's recognized.
Yes, I'm going to use a technique that Rush Limbaugh callers use to try and shorten the debate here. I'm just going to say ditto, which incorporates my previous remarks. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
And ditto to you. If there's no further discussion, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The amendment fails. And let's see here. The clerk will be glad to call the roll.
Chairman Gordon.
No.
Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Mr. Wu. No. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Barrett. No. Mr. Barrett votes no. Mr. Miller. No. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes no. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Fudge. Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Garamendi.
No.
Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Rothman. No. Mr. Rothman votes no. Mr. Matheson. No. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Davis. No. Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Hill. No. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. No. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Ms. Dahlkemper. Ms. Dahlkemper votes no. Mr. Grayson. No. Mr. Grayson votes no. Ms. Cosmas. Ms. Cosmas votes no. Mr. Peters. No. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Hall.
Aye.
Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher. Yes. Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett. Present. Mr. Bartlett votes present. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Ehlers votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mrs. Biggert. No. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Yes. Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer. Aye. Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. Inglis. Aye. Mr. Inglis votes aye. Mr. McCall. Aye. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith. Aye. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Olson. Aye. Mr. Olson votes aye.
Has all members been recorded? Oh, Mr. Lipinski?
Mr. Lipinski is not recorded. No. Mr. Lipinski votes no.
And what was Mr. Lipinski's time? Okay. Mr. Carnahan?
Mr. Carnahan is not recorded. No. Mr. Carnahan votes no.
Is there anyone else wish to be recorded? If not, the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, I have 11 members voting aye, 25 voting no, and 1 present.
Thank you. The ayes, or the nays prevail. The next amendment, the 4th amendment on the roster, is also offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Diaz-Balart. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 022, amendment offered by Mr. Mario Diaz-Balart of Florida to the amendment offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm going to be more brief because I kind of have an inkling of where things are going. Just call me crazy, but I'm good at grasping the obvious. Mr. Chairman, very similar. This amendment would simply strike out the last, the out-year fundings of the bill to make it a 3-year bill. By doing that, it would reduce spending in this bill by $37.02 billion. I think we've already heard the arguments, and I don't think, Mr. Chairman, that we need to hear them again.
I think Mr. Diaz-Balart has given us all the arguments here then. So is there any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Hall.
I'll be brief. I'm for it.
As Mr. Diaz-Balart has said, we have discussed this a variety of times already. By cutting from 5 to 3, you don't really save any money those first 3 years, and we lose the continuity in the out years. So if there's no further discussion, all in favor of the amendment, say aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Inquiry of the Chair.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment later on, which would have been, if this were to pass and another part of the bill, should I withdraw that now? Or because I think I kind of know where that's going to go as well.
I would defer to your counsel.
Okay. We can withdraw it later, Mr. Chairman, then.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
So what are they doing with this one? It defeated?
I am, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Amendment number 038, amendment offered by Mr. Rohrabacher of California to the amendment offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This amendment reduces the authorization for ARPA-E, specifically ARPA-E, from 10 years in the current legislation to 3 years. And let's just note that we have responsibility in this committee, not only for authorization but also oversight. The responsibility of this committee is not just to authorize but to oversee how we have spending. I believe that providing us a little extra time before we authorize something for 10 years, that we need some more time for oversight. Let me just, before I go on with the rest of this presentation in terms of my amendment, I'd like to thank the chairman for the good job that he's done and for the very fair and efficient way that he has handled this committee and put up with us who have some fundamental disagreements with him. So let me just, you will be missed as chairman of this committee. And I just thought I would mention that before I go on with these arguments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher, but you're not going to miss me for a while because I'm going to be around and we'll be working together on some things. Let me, just for the record, be sure that it's noted that the last amendment did not pass. Also, and Mr. Rohrabacher, certainly, you know I have an affection for RP, and you are doing what you think is best for the country, and there's nothing personal whatsoever. Once again, this committee will have the option to have oversight. We can have it every day, every week, however you want to do it. So I think there'll be plenty of oversight on this, on ARPA, and I welcome it. I think that the more daylight it gets, the better it's going to look, and so.
Well, let me explain, Mr. Chairman, I mean my time.
Yes, sir.
Why I believe that for us to have proper oversight, we cannot just simply authorize this effort for 10 years out before we have actually been able to assess what's happened in its first year of funding. ARPA-E, which is a concept that I support, has just embarked on its mission. And we need to find out. We need to find out whether or not, as the program is actually being handled, whether or not they are really funding high-risk projects or whether they're funding projects that could have happened anyway. Are they really funding projects that are unique enough that they need to be spending the money in that area rather than perhaps funding projects that are duplicative of things in other parts of the Department of Energy, for example? So it would seem to me that before we actually even have 1 year of activity on the part of ARPA-E, that we then authorize it for 10 years out. What's the harm of saying we're only going to do this for 3 years, and then we will assess the job that ARPA-E is doing to see if it is indeed meeting the goals that we had in mind when ARPA-E passed in the first place. So this gives us a chance not just to spend money, and we have as people can tell by the record, we have a difference of opinion as to what level of spending is justified. But beyond that, we should make sure that whatever money is spent, there shouldn't be any argument over what money is spent, whether or not we are actually providing the oversight to make sure the money is being spent wisely. And my amendment would simply give this committee the opportunity to assess ARPA-E after its first 3 years of active duty, and to see whether or not some changes need to be made rather than authorizing it out for a 10-year period. I yield back the balance of my time.
Dr. Baird's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, in listening to the argument that by shortening an authorization, we somehow save money for the taxpayer, I think I'm going to save my family money by just not feeding my kids. They're 5 now, and once they reach 7, I'm just going to quit feeding them, and that's going to help my budget a great deal because we'll save a lot of money by not feeding them.
That's not my argument about saving money.
Oh, okay. Well, let's deal with the second question, which is your quote was, and your quote was, what is the harm? I think we've described the harm. The harm is you undermine the ability of individuals, organizations, businesses, et cetera, to make plans on the anticipation that there will be a reliable opportunity to compete for these funds. As far as the oversight, you know, I spent 3 days participating in the ARPA-E forum that they had over at the National Harbor, and I will tell you, to me, speaking personally, I think ARPA-E is the most exciting thing happening in the United States government today. I truly believe that. I honestly do. I think if there's anything that has come out of this Congress in the last 4 or 5 years that's really going to turn this country around, it's going to be something that emerges from the funding from ARPA-E. That's why I'm so excited about it. I share passionately my colleague, Mr. Diaz-Balart, Mr. Rohrabacher, Mr. Brown's commitment to trying to reduce our deficit. I honestly believe that one of the things that is going to help reduce our deficit in the long run is ARPA-E, because it's going to reduce our dependency on foreign oil, because it's going to lower our energy consumption, and because it's going to make America so competitive with the rest of the world. And the final point I would make is if you compare what we are spending on ARPA-E with other spending in this bill, it's actually relatively small. And more problematic still, if you compare what we're spending on ARPA-E with what other nations, notably China and other countries, are spending on their energy research budget, it's frighteningly small. And so for that reason, I would certainly not want to cut either the funding levels or the duration of ARPA-E.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
And I appreciate your passion for ARPA-E and its mission. And I happen to believe that the mission is a good mission, but again, I don't really think that you have addressed the idea of why then should we not, why should we just give it a 10-year authorization rather than saying after 3 years we're going to find out to see if we can perfect it even more, or we can then take a look and make sure it's doing the job that you so passionately believe it should be doing.
Well, I think 3 years is just too brief. I just think, you know, if you're, the way ARPA is working is they're having funding put out in tranches, okay? So they're now on their 3rd, and if you look at the diversity of technologies, but you know, these things take some time to build up, and people are going to be saying, okay, so we're going to try to get our research and engineering and production, et cetera, to a point where we think we can compete meaningfully for ARPA-E. And that may take them several years to get there. And sometimes they're going to be rejected by ARPA-E in one of the application processes. They're going to go back to the drawing board, as good scientists and engineers do, and they're going to come back and make another run at it, and they'll have something better. But if we say to them, you know, you really can't count on ARPA-E being there in the long run, or even in the relatively near run, I think we're going to set that back. And we may disagree. Maybe somewhere between 3 and 10 years, we might find agreement. I think 3 is too short.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I actually support Mr. Rohrbacher's amendment. Ask unanimous consent to revise and extend because ARPA E is still in the formative stages. It makes a lot of sense to keep its authorization shorter so Congress could reevaluate in a couple of years and address any concerns or problems. Yield back my time, and I thank Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Let me just remind Mr. Rohrbacher that any program that can be authorized can be unauthorized. And so we do not have to wait to the end of it. We can have, and I would hope there will be frequent, transparent oversight. I think it's sort of like you, Mr. Rohrbacher. The more you see it, the more you'll like it. So if there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Those opposed, say no. No. The amendment is not agreed to. And the 6th amendment. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered also by the gentleman from California. Mr. Rohrbacher, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am.
I have an amendment at the desk. Excuse me, the clerk report the amendment.
Amendment number 033, amendment offered by Mr. Rohrbacher of California to the amendment offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
This second amendment actually, instead of taking the authorization down to 3 years, understanding the wisdom of Mr. Baird's last statement, perhaps 3 years wasn't responsible or reasonable enough, and that actually this just takes the authorization down to 5 years, and I would add it makes the authorization of ARPA E consistent with the authorization in the rest of this legislation. And so that's basically it. The arguments still hold. Hopefully this is more reasonable and meets Mr. Baird's threshold.
Mr. Rohrbacher, in respect to your good faith, we will accept this amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to echo that myself personally. I think that's a timeline that makes good sense to me, and I'm happy to support it as well.
Maybe we better reread it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I accept your acceptance.
It's my understanding that, let's see. If there's no further discussion, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and Mr. Rohrbacher wins one. I understand that Ms. Biggert wants to be recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 102, amendment offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois to the amendment offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you. This is an amendment which would reduce the funding per year on page 16 of the bill. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble locating this. This one. Several of my colleagues before me have proposed ways to reduce the proposed spending of ARPA E, and did not want to cut the years off the authorization. I don't think that's the best way to go, but I thought maybe I could propose slightly lower numbers that might meet a compromise. And I appreciate all you've done to consider our spending concerns, and thought that we might be able to work together to lower ARPA E's funding levels as we have in other parts of the bill. Since we did take out the clause that the Office of Science would be funded before the dollars went to ARPA E. And in testimony before this committee, Secretary Chu suggested the funding levels proposed in your amendment But that was before he was the secretary. In fact, it was in 2006, and a lot has changed since that time. So this would propose that the funding levels would be 300 million in 2011, 400 million in 2012, 500 million in 2013, and then in 2014, 600 million 2014, and 700 million for a fiscal year 2015, and I think that would actually cut the authorization from 2.1 billion from 3.1 billion to 2.1 billion, and I would ask for your consideration.
Thank you. The chairman recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Once again, I will remind everyone that we have already cut this bill by over 10%. The out-year number for ARPA-E was the minimum number that was recommended by the Rising Above the Gathering Storm Committee. Is there anyone else?
Mr. Chairman?
Dr. Bartlett.
Yes. There's a little confusion here because I thought the amendment that before us was your manager's amendment. Her amendment to the amendment is on page 16 of the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee. When does that come before us?
That's what this is.
You have
the manager's amendment has already been.
You have two amendments. You have the manager's amendment, and then you have the amendment to the manager's amendment. And her amendment is to the amendment to the manager's amendment, not to the manager's amendment.
I am advised that
An amendment to the amendment offered by Mr. Gordon.
But if you look for page 16, it's in this one. It is not in the manager's amendment. I looked for page 16 in the manager's amendment with numbers on it in vain. Then I found the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Gordon, and sure enough, on page 16 of that amendment, I found the numbers that Ms. Biggert is talking about.
Well, the astute Mr. Bartlett has found something here, and we are getting our able counsels together to get you a good answer.
Point of order. If that's the case, it sounds to me that it's a third order amendment and therefore should be ruled out of order.
Okay, Dr. Bartlett, the bipartisan council confab here has said that it is in proper order. The bottom line is that the gentlelady's amendment would reduce the appropriations for ARPA-E over the 5-year period. And as I pointed out earlier, we've already reduced the overall budget cuts. But it's my understanding is that we are moving forward in the proper way.
Will we at any point consider your amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee, or will we by unanimous consent agree that that is now a part of the manager's amendment?
It is the next vote. We are taking these second-degree amendments, and then the next vote will be on the manager's amendment.
But when will your amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee, this is an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. It was in my packet. And it's at page 16 of that amendment that she refers to in her second-degree amendment.
I'm advised by counsel at the end, all 54 amendments will be addressed, including the manager amendment, in the nature of a substitute.
The amendment in the nature of substitute was brought up, was considered original.
Okay, well, but that's okay.
Then Mr. Gordon offered his amendment. We are now amending his amendment.
Okay,
His
okay,
amendment will be
okay.
voted on.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Again,
So the amendment really before us is not the manager's amendment. It is the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Gordon. Is that correct?
Yes, same thing.
That is correct.
that is correct, but it's my understanding that those are synonymous terms.
But they're two different pieces of paper. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bartlett. Is there any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Bayard's recognized.
Just very briefly, you know, there's been a lot of talk about public spending, and there should be a lot of talk about that. But I'll tell you back home, the folks I represent, when you ask them, how do you want money spent on energy research? They're going to often say, I want it spent on something that's going to create American jobs, that's going to lower my cost of energy, that's going to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. And I think that's what ARPA-E does. And I'm very loath to do what I'm about to do, but I think it's necessary. ARPA-E focuses on those things that I think are going to be game-changing research, as do much of the other DOE labs. But if you look at the ARPA-E budget relative to the other DOE labs, or whether to DOE labs, like Argonne, for example, Argonne gets $1 billion a year. $1 billion. Now, they do important research there. I don't dispute that. But it is double or treble what ARPA gets. And we don't yet know the results of ARPA fully, but I would submit that if you look at this broad spectrum of innovative energy research funded under ARPA, and you put it to the test of the average person in the general public and say, does this make some sense to you? I think it's favorably towards Argonne. And I'm not going to call for the cutting and reduction of Argonne for a second. I would not do that. But I would put that budget, which is several factors higher than the budget for ARPA, up for comparison, and suggest that before we start cutting ARPA, if we're to start cutting ARPA, then we need to start looking at some other things as well. And I'm not inclined to do that because I think it would be a mistake, but I think it's equally egregious mistake to go after ARPA, and I'll yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Biggert.
Thank you. You know, I really do support ARPA. I do support the Office of Science, and you hit me in the heart with Argonne. But I think that all of the labs are very, very important, and they serve a purpose that is what I think probably is larger than what we are starting out with ARPA-E. ARPA-E is for innovation and creativity that comes from the outside, but the labs themselves have all had very, very expensive projects. Let's take the advanced photon source, which has to be upgraded now. These are all things that are in progress, and I think that ARPA-E is a new program, and I just thought that when we had put in ARPA-E that it would be at a funding level which would not reduce the cost of the Office of Science, and that was removed, so that's why I just thought we would reduce, and I did give you a little wrong numbers, but because I didn't think that this was the right place for this, but to $2.5 billion from $3.150 billion. You know, it's again, I can understand why you don't want to do that, and so we have a disagreement.
Thanks, Ms. Big. You know, I think this discussion is a little bit like saying which of your children is the cutest. You know, I mean, all these programs are important. There's a synergy as they work together, and I think they'll all benefit each other. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the manager's amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The seventh amendment is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Johnson. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 114, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking member and members of the committee. I want to thank you for the attention and commitment to this legislation. It has been an uphill battle in getting equality for women when it comes to reaching the higher echelons of scientific achievement. As women continue to be underrepresented in most STEM fields, we must do more to create opportunities to educate and retain them, especially at the university faculty level. A National Academy's publication, Beyond Bias and Barriers, Fulfilling the Potential of Women in Academic Science and Engineering, provides specific policy directives to help accomplish this goal. Based on the National Academy's recommendation, I have introduced the Fulfilling of the Potential of Women in Academic Science and Engineering Act, which I first introduced in the 110th Congress and have reintroduced in 111th. I'd like to thank the representatives Donna Edwards, Suzanne Cosmos, Marcia Fudge, and Charles Wilson, Ellen Graydon, and Kathy Dahlkemper, who were co-sponsors, and I invite the rest of the full committee to be co-sponsors. Fulfilling the Potential of Women in Academic Science and Engineering Act. I thank the American Association of University Women, National Coalition for Women and Girls in Education, the Society of Women Engineers, the National Science Teachers Association, the American Chemical Society, and others for supporting this amendment. This committee has held many hearings where distinguished experts testified about the combination of factors that leads to the failure of women to attain careers in areas such as computer science, physics, and engineering. Beyond Bias and Barriers provides clear guidelines to universities, federal agencies, professional organizations, and to Congress on what actions to take to reduce gender bias at the university level. Beyond Bias and Barriers also recommended that higher education organizations form an inter-institution monitoring organization, and that scientific and professional societies help set professional and equity standards for the activities that they lead, such as awards and conferences. As stated in Beyond Bias and Barriers, if systemic differences between male and female scientific and mathematical aptitude and ability do exist, it is clear that they cannot account for women's underrepresentation in academic science and engineering. I am pleased to see that many of these recommendations are reflected in this amendment to be offered to America Competes. First, my amendment creates a workshop program to enhance gender equity in the academic STEM environment. Secondly, it established a directive for science agencies to establish policies for extended grant support and interim technical support for researchers needing a leave of absence for care of giving responsibilities. Third, it requires more thorough data regarding federal research grants award and positive incentives for academic institutions that are proactive in terms of gender sensitivity and equal opportunities for female scientists. Many experts, policymakers, educators, and other professionals feel that not nearly enough is being done to educate persons of influence in the subtle gender bias exists. Gender bias is holding women back from achieving at the same level as their counterparts. This is a good amendment. I've been called by many college presidents to push forward with it. And so I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back to balance of my time. I thought I'd go over.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. It's well documented, as you point out, that women and minorities are underrepresented in the STEM fields. You have been a champion in trying to rectify that, and this is one more step forward in making our country more competitive. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, then the vote is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The next amendment and the motion is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dahlkemper. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 033, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Dahlkemper of Pennsylvania.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Hall, for allowing me to offer this critical amendment. I want to thank you also for your leadership regarding this, I think, critical bill. I know it holds a special importance to you, Mr. Chairman, and so it's timely also for our manufacturers, our current and future workforce, our educators, and our economy. My amendment adds an important component to the National Science Foundation's efforts to enhance and to grow our nation's manufacturing sector. It directs the director of the National Science Foundation to award grants to strengthen and expand scientific and technical education and training in advanced manufacturing, including through the Foundation's Advanced Technology Education Program. We know that manufacturing education is an essential component to America's competitiveness abroad and an absolute necessity in keeping and growing jobs in our community, in our economy. If we do not take meaningful steps to begin to close that gap between the skills and the talents of workers and the advanced manufacturing needs of employers, we'll continue to experience the devastating impact in our communities across the nation as more and more of our economic future is outsourced to other countries. This amendment ensures the investments in developing a workforce that meets the needs of the next generation of American manufacturing by prioritizing the inclusion of timely and relevant manufacturing education as a part of NSF's Advanced Technical Education Program, which emphasizes development and curriculum that will enhance the manufacturing knowledge and training of undergraduates in the scientific and technical fields, as well as that of the elementary and post-secondary instructors and practitioners. Awarding grants in the area of strengthening and expanding manufacturing education also serves in another important purpose, to provide opportunities for employees to maintain the relevant skills and training that will allow them to compete as the field of manufacturing grows more complex. Providing workers with the career development necessary to keep pace with the growth in their field is critical to job stability and job mobility. We want our nation's scientific and technical workers to have the tools they need to perform successfully both here and abroad. Mr. Chairman, ensuring that America is able to compete in a rapidly changing global economy starts with making vital investments that guarantee educational and training systems that are robust in resources as well as results. I believe this amendment helps us do just that, and I urge my colleagues' support. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Dalkemper, for that excellent amendment. Is there further discussion? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Dr. Brown is next. If he's, as for any of you that have come in later, the ground rules that were set was that if when your time comes up for an amendment, if you're not here, someone can introduce it for you, or we'll come back and pick you up at the end, so that you can't just be coming in and everybody else has to grind it out. So Dr. Brown is not here, but he can come back, and Mr. Inglis is here. So. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 017, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Inglis of South Carolina.
I ask unanimous consent that dispense with the reading, and without objection so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment amends the NSF prize language from Dr. Lipinski to ensure that federal research grant dollars are not used to meet the requirements for a prize award. It's essentially an attempt to prevent double dipping and echoes an H-prize provision that prevented federal employees from participating using federal dollars to compete for other federal dollars in the form of a prize. So, and I believe that Dr. Lipinski wanted to engage in a colloquy about that, and I'm happy to yield to him if this would be an appropriate time.
Yes, Mr. Inglis would like to yield.
I'm happy to yield.
I appreciate your concern about double dipping, and I know this is something that on the H prize, which we worked on together. Really, you had the original author of that, and we got that done under my authorship, but we worked on this issue in there and put some language in there to prevent the double dipping. Excuse me, I appreciate, it's that run this morning, and the cold got to me. If you excuse me. I appreciate Mr. Inglis wants to prevent what he sees as double dipping. I have a little bit of a concern on this, and I definitely think we should prevent double dipping. I have a little bit of a concern it's a little bit too broad, the way that especially if you're talking about federal employees, certainly I think that we want to prevent what would definitely be seen as double dipping. If you're receiving an NSF grant, though, I'm afraid that this might say that anyone who's ever received any NSF funding would not be eligible for a prize. I think that I'd be happy to accept this amendment if Mr. Inglis would agree that we'll continue to work on this and maybe try to narrow it down a little bit to make sure that we're getting exactly what we want to get in this amendment, and then we could move forward in the manager's amendment before, as the bill comes to the floor, if we can work on that and work on that language to clarify and narrow this amendment. If Mr. Inglis would agree to that, then be happy to accept the amendment.
And reclaim my time. I'm happy to agree to that, Dr. Lipinski and Mr. Chairman. I think it makes sense to figure out, we're both trying to accomplish the same thing. We want to see that there's not double dipping. And at the same time, we don't want to cut off the creativity of people who may have received NSF grants that are unrelated to the work that they're doing related to the prize. So there may be somebody who has an NSF grant who in his or her time on their own at night is thinking about the solution to a key issue that confronts us, and unrelated to their funding from their NSF grant may provide the breakthrough. So we surely want to reward that kind of after-hours effort. We just don't want there to be double dipping because it would violate the spirit of the prize. And I'd be happy to yield further, Dr. Lipinski.
I think this is going to take a little bit more discussion about what exactly, it's very difficult in the scientific endeavor to separate out one piece of work from another piece of work that someone engages in. So I think that as we discuss this and consult also with others on this, as we have begun to do here, I'm sure that we can work this out, and I appreciate Mr. Inglis's desire to make sure that we are saving money. No taxpayer wants to see anyone as a double dipper. We're trying to save money here and cut the deficit. So I appreciate Mr. Inglis's work on this.
And so it sounds like I get an acceptable amendment, Mr. Chairman, which is an exciting thing.
Well, Mr. English, you have demonstrated, you and Dr. Lipinski have demonstrated an effort to work collegially and productively on this issue, and I'm sure you will continue with that. So if there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Hall, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am. I have an amendment to the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 012, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Hall of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the Academic Research Facilities Modernization Program was a bricks and mortar for university programs at the National Science Foundation. It was first authorized in 1988. It was essentially dormant from the early 90s until the administration revived it in the American Recovery Act. I simply don't believe it's the federal government's role or responsibility to construct or renovate university science labs and buildings. Funding bricks and mortar projects take much-needed research dollars away from actually performing research. The NSF already funds major research facilities with multiple users as well as major research instrumentation. I believe these provide valuable assets for our nation, but a program such as ARI that allows schools to apply for grants to improve their facilities is ripe for potential future earmarks. I believe, Mr. Chairman, that you share my belief that NSF remain an earmark-free entity. I move the passage of this amendment.
The gentleman, thank you, Mr. Hall.
Mr. Chairman, while the amendment doesn't affect the current solicitation for projects under the American Recovery Act, it does repeal this program in FY11. That's the only difference.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. The chairman recognizes himself. I am torn on this, Mr. Hall, in that conceptually I agree with you. This has been a program that's been authorized since 1993. It had not been funded for the reasons that you spoke, eloquently about. However, I think it does make sense that for those anomalies, and we saw that anomaly with this recent tremendous recess, that there might be occasions where it could be beneficial. So I think it is beneficial to keep it in the toolbox, but that it is something that should not be used as earmarking and taking funds away from the National Science Foundation. And for that reason, I modestly and reluctantly oppose your amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that the gentleman from Texas has the best interests of taxpayers at heart, as he always makes sure that he does as the ranking member here. I a little bit more strongly oppose this amendment. I think that if you go back in the history of this, you see, I know Mr. Hall is concerned about earmarking. We actually, one of the reasons this was put in was that we saw that there was earmarking that was going on by Congress, and thought that Congress believed that this is the way to make sure that you have an independent, have the NSF deciding where the funding is going to go. My concern is that we have a $3.5 billion in needed renovations, according to the 2005 Survey of Science and Engineering Research Facilities. We've only seen an increase in that need with the recession. And the concerns are twofold. One is that if we do not have these state-of-the-art lab spaces, networks, instruments, computing facilities, that we will not be spending the funding that we are giving in regard to grants for research. We will not be spending that as efficiently because we do not have the facilities that are needed to do the best research. The other concern I have is I have certainly heard conducting hearings, a hearing on this, listening sessions I heard with universities, other institutions, said that there's great concern that we're losing researchers to countries, especially such as China, that are investing significantly in their facilities, and that we are training, we are the best at training scientists, engineers here in this country, but more and more we are losing these researchers to other countries that are offering better facilities, and I think that's another concern that I have. We have not appropriated funding. Congress has not appropriated funding for this in recent years, except for the Recovery Act. I think it's important that we keep this in there, especially as we await the next report on what kind of deferred maintenance is going on. Especially, as I said, I think it'll be even worse now with the recession, especially hitting the state institutions, state universities. So I appreciate the concern that Mr. Hall has, but I definitely have to oppose this amendment. I yield back.
Chairman.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
My colleagues are concerned about this. I understand it's a problem. I would have no problem working with you, Mr. Chairman, to ensure that we're explicit about this. However, I feel pretty strongly that no future funding ought to go to this program. It could probably still be subject to earmarks if earmarks are still in vogue by the time somebody wants to avail them. But I encourage the adoption of the amendment. I yield back my time.
If there's no further discussion on the...
Mr. Chairman?
Dr. Bartlett.
Yes, I agree that we may need to put more money into facilities because you can't have people working when they don't have facilities to work in. But I think this is a wrong mission for the for the Science Foundation. This is not what they do. They'd have to hire a bunch of whole new people to do this. And if the federal government is going to support this, I just think it would be better supported somewhere else rather than the National Science Foundation, because I don't think that they're traditionally tooled up to do this. I'm not sure they do a very good job of it. So I want to support the potential need for federal money to go here, but I'm going to support Mr. Hall's motion. I don't think the National Science Foundation is the right place to do this. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Lipinski is recognized.
Thank you. I just want to quickly add the reason why this was put in the NSF is to avoid the earmarking, so that it would be merit reviewed, as everything is in the NSF. They do have the infrastructure in the NSF to be able to do these reviews, and I think that's the appropriate place to do it, to make sure, to be best assured that the money is going to the correct places. I yield back.
If there's...
I'm not sure how you peer review building a building. I don't know how you do that, which is why I think the National Science Foundation is the wrong place for this. Thanks.
If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Neuenbarger. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Actually, I am, Mr. Chairman, and ask unanimous consent that I'm going to withdraw amendment number 8 and number 13 and ask to proceed with amendment number 26.
Without objection, so ordered. Let's see. Now, then the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 026, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Nagelbauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope it didn't offend you that I withdrew those other two amendments.
Okay, Mr. Nagelbauer, let me, okay, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. And I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope it didn't offend you that I withdrew those other two. You know, Mr. Chairman and I had a fairly robust debate about the match, and I've conceded that point. But what this amendment does is that it says that current law allows them to participate in kind. If we're going to move the match from 70 to 30, I'm offering an amendment that seeks to make sure that the schools actually put up hard money. So my amendment does not restrict them from providing in-kind services, merely that they cannot be counted towards their 30% match. As we often hear, the federal government continues to overpromise and to many under-deliver. This is an opportunity to set a pragmatic goals and more realistic levels of funding. My amendment strives to maintain appropriate levels of responsible burden sharing, requiring participating schools to have skin in the game, which is a laudable goal. There's no one at this dais that doesn't see that cities, towns, and states and universities are scaling back, yet time and time again up here in Washington we fail to do the same. I think it's time, as we've heard many of our my colleagues say, to restore fiscal balance, and we continue to provide appropriate resources that can provide to continue to lead in these leading areas. And so basically, Mr. Chairman, this is pretty straightforward. This is if we're going to change the match from 70-30, that the universities would have to put up matching funds and not in-kind. Doesn't keep them from doing the in-kind, but does make sure that they have putting their money up with it. So with that, I would urge adoption.
Thank you, Mr. Neuenbarger. And the chairman recognizes himself for 5 minutes. As you said, we had a discussion on the other issues. This is a novel one, and I am sympathetic to your concern that it's not gamed with a lot of in-kind. My concern, though, is whether NSF needs some flexibility there. And I have not had a chance to discuss it with them. Where I am today, just as a friend, I would have to oppose it because I don't know enough about it, but I would still revisit it and see if there's a way to give some flexibility, yet ratchet that down. We can either do it one or two ways. You can withdraw and we'll look at it some more. We'll likely vote it down, but that doesn't mean that we're through discussing it, because I think you're on the right track. I'm just not sure what the unintended consequences are because we haven't had a chance to look at it more.
Well, I think I think the standards are there. What is in-kind and isn't in-kind.
But whether they need 2 or 3%, you know, I mean, whether there's something that
but I think what happens is, as you know, and I think you used the correct term, people that get grants have learned to game the system in many cases. And if we're going to increase the federal participation to a very generous level, as you know, and I'm conceding a point that I disagree with, but I think if we're going to concede that the federal government is going to put in 70%, and those are going to be hard dollars, I do not think it's unrealistic or unfair to ask those universities to at least come up with 30% of their hard money. That many times they're going to use in kind to perpetuate the program, and in many cases, some of their hard dollars actually comes from third parties. My piece of legislation doesn't, keep that hard money coming from third parties. But what I do think they need to do is to, have skin in the game, and I think 30% of hard money is realistic. And again, it doesn't preclude them from doing, using the other things to, you know, to foster the program. If they find that program beneficial, they can use those in-kind things. But because we had a little bit of disagreement on the math, but when you go to the 70%, you know, you are going to shrink the numbers of programs that are out there, because you're going to be putting more dollars in where you were spreading those dollars out. So I would ask the chairman to reconsider. If it is voted down, I would hope that he would, you know, be true to his commitment to, if we can't work this out today, to work on it moving forward.
I thank my friend, and I reclaim my time. First, we need to make clear whether you've got a 70% match or a 50% match or whatever it is. It's the same amount of money, federal dollars, so that, you know, that doesn't vary. What I would like to do is give, when I say the benefit of the doubt, I mean, I would like to go ahead and accept this amendment today, but I don't want to mislead you. I want to learn more about it. We may have to deal with it again in the, you know, in the manager's amendment or some way if NSF convinces us that there is some legitimate reason to have some, you know, nominal amount there.
I concur with that, and would look forward to their response, and you know, and then after we've seen their response, you and I having some dialogue about that.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Dr. Ehlers. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 039, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Ehlers of Michigan.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Well, it shouldn't take 5 minutes. This is very straightforward. It simply recognizes a change that has occurred in undergraduate education, particularly in the life sciences. New programs are being developed across the country, and in fact, a few of my neighboring colleges have already put these programs into place, dealing with sustainability. There's an increased need for that, whether one is an architect or a scientist or a life scientist. More and more of these programs are needed because students are getting jobs in those areas, and this is just an attempt to upgrade and keep up with the changing times, to recognize that sustainability programs should be added to the list of approved activities that grants in the Transforming Undergraduate Education in STEM program. It will simply add that one area of sustainability to the existing grant programs that will be allowed under this legislation. I urge adoption of the amendment.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers, for your good amendment. Is there further discussion on your amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to, and we are a fourth of the way through. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Wilson. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment I am proposing today builds on the excellent work done by Congresswoman Fudge during a subcommittee markup. Her addition of the grand challenges in education research section is crucial. I believe it will greatly improve research on pre-K through 12 STEM education. Excuse me. My amendment is simple. I ask that the National Science Foundation and the Department of Education work together to identify the research challenges in STEM education. They also specifically evaluate the barriers being faced by students in rural schools. I represent a very rural part of Ohio, and too many of our rural students are struggling to receive an adequate STEM education. Sadly, many of our rural schools lack the resources needed to provide the STEM education necessary for funding for students entering the 21st century workforce. Therefore, I ask my colleagues to support my amendment that would have the Department of Education and National Science Foundation specifically consider students in rural schools as they work to resolve the current challenge facing pre-K through 12 STEM education. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would you gentlemen yield?
Certainly.
I think it's a good amendment. We support it.
Thank you.
Is there further discussion? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, all those that favor the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland, Dr. Bartlett. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, sir. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 011, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Bartlett of Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this is a very simple amendment which supports your commitment to exclude projects from this reauthorization that went unfunded in the original completes bill. This program was not only unfunded up to now, but my understanding is that the National Science Foundation says they have no intent to fund it now. So my question is, why include it? To make the bill relevant, I just would ask that we delete this program. If we think that they're in error for doing this, then we need to talk about that before the bill comes to the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers. And Ms. Fudge is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to voice my support for the Partnerships for Access to Laboratory Science pilot program. It is becoming more and more apparent how important these hands-on learning activities are for students. It is also no secret that high-need schools, for the most part, have insufficient tools to meet curricular demands. In 2002, almost 60% of teachers in Washington, D.C. and in Chicago, Illinois, reported that the science labs in their schools were somewhat or very inadequate to meet curricular standards, or that they had no science labs at all. Access to laboratory equipment is essential in recruiting and retaining students in STEM fields. According to a report from the U.S. General Accounting Office in 2005, researchers found that approximately 40% of those college students who left the science fields reported some problem related to high school science preparation. Dr. Ehlers and I have introduced a resolution supporting the ideals of National Lab Day, an initiative that calls for businesses and professional volunteers to partner with schools to give students exposure to the STEM fields and hands-on experiences with STEM activities. I know that my colleagues across the aisle believe in the importance of lab experiences, which is why I don't understand why they do not want to authorize the PALS program. Please oppose this amendment, and I thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lujan is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And just to emphasize my support as well with the PALS program, Mr. Chairman, we also have the National Research Council who looked at this issue across the country back in 2005 as well, a study which looked at the role laboratory learning can have for the country's high school students in the current situation of laboratory learning. And we continue to see how there's problem after problem with the lack of access, Mr. Chairman. The NRC report found that laboratory science programs in high school classrooms are in disarray, and certain factors seriously hamper efforts to improve them. In particular, the National Academy's report that was highlighted earlier as well found that the vast majority of laboratory science programs in high school classrooms are also in disarray. So this is consistent information of two different groups that have looked at this, Mr. Chairman. And while this program hasn't received funding within the last 3 years, there's still a great need for to further examine the role that laboratory experiences can play in improving STEM education at the high school level. And especially all the emphasis that we have in STEM, Mr. Chairman, it seems to me that we should be looking at supporting programs and expanding them as opposed to pulling away at a time when students are at the most need around the country. I thank Mr. Chairman, yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lujan. And Dr. Bartlett.
Mr. Chairman, keeping this in the bill when Science Foundation says they're not going to fund it does not meet the objectives of these two speakers. If, in fact, we think that they are in error and they ought to fund it, then we need to amend the bill so that we require them to fund it. Just keeping it in there, doesn't do anything if their intent is not to fund it. So I will withdraw my amendment and ask that we work together between now and when it comes to the floor to determine whether or not this committee thinks that they are in error and that they should support this. We need to come to one of two conclusions. Either they're wrong and we're going to require them to support it, or they're right in not supporting it, and therefore going to remove the language from the bill.
As usual, Dr. Bartlett, it's very logical, and so this conversation will continue, and we will pass on this amendment, and we will then move to the next amendment on the roster, which is offered by the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Wu. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 041, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Wu of Oregon.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My amendment improves American students' competitiveness in this very difficult job market through expanded internship opportunities for undergraduate students and potentially high school students in private sector, for internships in private sector STEM employers. Internships have a strong track record of preparing students for careers, and they are a particularly valuable tool for students in STEM fields. According to the National Association of Colleges and Employers, companies extended job offers to 70% of their interns in 2008. One reason why college graduates with internship experience are so much more competitive in the job market is that there's a significant skills gap between what is needed to complete an undergraduate degree in a STEM field and the skills needed for success in a STEM career. Even in the current economic climate, many high-tech companies report that they are unable to fill open positions because the college graduates applying for them lack the skills needed for success. My amendment today will help bridge the knowledge gap that prevents some STEM graduates from getting jobs in science and technology workforce by creating internship opportunities that can be integrated with students' STEM coursework. The amendment expands upon grant opportunities at the National Science Foundation for universities and stakeholder consortia to establish or expand partnerships with local or regional private sector organizations for the purpose of providing undergraduate students with integrated internship experiences. My amendment also provides incentives to encourage universities and stakeholder consortia to coordinate with local and regional private sector entities in developing academic courses so that students will have the skills necessary for employment in companies in their community and in their region. It does so by helping university and their partners identify areas where students need more instruction prior to graduation and providing specific coursework that prepares students for jobs in their respective fields immediately upon graduation. In addition, my amendment requires NSF to report to Congress on its implementation of these grants, including their effect on workforce preparation and job placement for participating students. Mr. Chairman, we focused on this amendment. I developed this amendment in part because of the job needs, the employment needs of Americans today in this very, very difficult environment, but also specifically because I have visited several employers in Oregon which are sponsoring internships, which are doing a great job of training young people, both high school students and college students, for future employment in STEM fields. And these employers are seeking some additional assistance and encouragement in order to expand the programs they already have and to encourage fellow employers to develop such programs. And I believe that this is an important source of future STEM employees and part of the solution for the unemployment problems that we have. And I believe that we have a strong responsibility to address the nation's rising need for STEM professionals. And I urge the committee's support, and I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from California.
How would this actually encourage the more internships?
The employers that I have spoken with say that they need some material support and also some support for program and curricula so that they can expand the program that they already have, or the programs that they already have, and also encourage fellow employers to ramp up such programs with lower development costs. and charging the NSF or expanding on NSF activities where they are currently doing some of these activities would support, in essence, some of the overhead costs that these programs currently bear.
Would this actually provide funds for companies that are then engaged, or companies or actually government entities that are providing more of these intern opportunities?
The funding is for the National Science Foundation and for the consortia. There is the potential for funding, for transferring some of the funding to the companies with internships. However, I believe that Minority Council raised an issue with direct funding of stipends, and that is to be resolved.
So but that is not in the current your amendment.
I do not believe so.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wu, for your good jobs amendment. And now, if there's no further discussion,
Mr. Chairman?
I think. Dr. Baird.
I just want to very briefly but effusively praise my colleague. In my discipline in the social sciences, internships are an absolutely essential part of our training. Immodestly, I just completed the 6th edition of my textbook on internships, but we tend to do that in the social sciences. We tend not to do it in some of the STEM fields. I think he's right on the money about the educational value of this, and urge passage of this.
If there's no further discussion,
Mr. Chairman?
Dr. Bartlett has a second-degree amendment.
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 023, amendment offered by Mr. Bartlett of Maryland to the amendment offered by Mr. Wu of Oregon.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I'm a huge fan of internships. They are, in effect, willing slave labor. They work so hard and do so much. And so I want to encourage that. I have a second-degree amendment, which I think that Mr. Wu has accepted. I'm very pleased at that. But I will tell you that I'm not happy where we are at the present moment, so I hope that we'll work together between now and when the bill comes to the floor. I am reluctant to exclude funding for internships at businesses. I'm very concerned that a huge percentage of all the research support in this country comes from the federal government. The federal government can be very arbitrary and capricious, and my wish would be for us to take less money from the private sector so they had more money to invest in basic research. And my hope is that there will be some basic research going on in companies where, I would hope that there might be a company which is doing better basic research than anybody supported with government funds, so that's where we'd want to send an intern. So I'd like to look at language in the final bill that does not completely write off internships for businesses. This amendment, I think, is a very simple amendment that addresses some of the problems that we have. By the way, if you're going to deny funding to any private sector partner, does that mean that the only universities that'll get money are those run by a government? I don't think that's what our intent. So I'd like to work together to refine the language of this bill before it comes to the floor.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
I welcome the gentleman's amendment. I think it moves us in the right direction.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If there's no further discussion on the amendment, Mr. Bartlett's amendment, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. Now the vote occurs on Mr. Wu's amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed upon. The next amendment on the roster is amendment offered by the gentleman from New Mexico. Mr. Lujan, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 049, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Lujan of New Mexico.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I will recognize the amendment for 5 minutes, or the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Hall, and thank you for your hard work on this bill. I'd also like to thank the chairman for including language in this bill that requires the director of the National Science Foundation to develop a plan for clarifying the objectives and rationale behind the proposal to consolidate NSF's minority serving institutions programs, including Hispanic Serving Institution undergraduate program required by Section 7033 of the American Competes Act of 2007. While I have serious concerns about this proposal, I'm encouraged by NSF's willingness to address these concerns over the next several months. My amendment today codifies the Tribal Colleges and University Program, otherwise known as TCUP, at the National Science Foundation. This program awards grants to tribal colleges and universities to enhance the quality of undergraduate science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and to increase the retention and graduation rates of Native American students pursuing degrees in STEM fields. These grants will support activities to improve courses and curriculum, as well as faculty development. New Mexico alone is home to over 22 different tribes, 17 of which are located in my district, including 3 tribal colleges and universities. These educational institutions are designed to support the unique learning needs of our Native American students who continue to be underrepresented in STEM fields. With that, Mr. Chairman, I urge the adoption of this amendment and thank my colleagues for their time today. We must invest in comprehensive, collaborative approaches to strengthen STEM teaching and learning in ways that improve access to retention within. And graduation from STEM programs is imperative, and that we prepare our students for the jobs of the future. Unfortunately, there's been a divide for too long that has kept minority students out of these fields. With that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your time today, and again, urge adoption. Yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lujan, for this good amendment. It is consistent with the testimony that this committee has received and recommendations that has been sent to this committee. Is there further discussion? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Mr. Diaz-Balart, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Mr. Chairman, this is the amendment that I had spoken about. We can withdraw now.
Oh, okay.
Like unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Thank you very much. And so now next amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Okay, thank you. Amendment 034, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. McCall of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, this amendment passed as a bill earlier unanimously by this committee and passed the House floor. The Green Energy Education Act will help train the next generation of architects and engineers in our universities to build greater energy-efficient buildings. And I urge support for this once again. And I also want to thank the chairman for the idea of bringing this up once again, under the Competes Act as another vehicle to hopefully pass this important legislation. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. As they say, try again. This is an excellent amendment, and I'm glad that there was a vehicle for it. I feel confident that this will finally be implemented, and it'll be good public policy and something that'll be a small part of your bigger legacy. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the amendment occurs. The vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment passes. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Hall, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am. I have an amendment to ask.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment 278, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5116, offered by Mr. Hall of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment simply modifies the mission of the engineering laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We'd reached an agreement on mission language for this lab prior to the filing of the manager's amendment. I don't want to start the chain on the manager. Roscoe's not here, but I don't want to start the chain again on the manager's amendments, but somehow it wasn't incorporated with all the moving parts of the markup process. This amendment is the simplest way to handle this oversight, I think. And I understand it will probably be accepted. As always, we're willing to work with you on any clarifying language necessary in the manager's amendment.
Mr. Hall, thank you for this good amendment. Sorry that it was not incorporated, but it just gives you an opportunity to, once again, talk about what good merits it has. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If no, then all those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. Dr. Brown, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment number 279, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5116, offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment would help our committee eliminate redundancy and help reduce the cost of new programs that the Title V innovation creates by striking the entire title altogether from this competes reauthorization. The federal loan guarantees Title V creates are similar to those that other agencies, such as the Small Business Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, offer to small businesses, including manufacturing businesses. Creating a new program at the Department of Commerce to back the same kind of loans would simply shift the loan guarantee funding burdens away from SBA and the USDA to the Department of Commerce. Why would our committee want to duplicate what other agencies are already administering? These loan guarantee programs are highly complex and require significant administrative effort to properly manage them. The effect would be to reduce resources available for the Department of Commerce to engage in its constitutional activities, such as NIST, developing the nation's standards of weights and measures. The Regional Innovation Clusters program also presents problems which call for their elimination. The main goal of this program is not on research and development, but to facilitate market development of products and services, which sounds to me like marketing and advertising. Certainly, these are goals that our committee should not support. Also, as in the case with the loan guarantee program, the language is so broad that one could interpret that our committee is authorizing funding for anything that the Department of Commerce wants. The definition of, quote, regional innovation cluster, unquote, makes no mention of technology development. Rather, it is a group of entities within a, quote, particularly industry sector, unquote, that, quote, have active channels for business transactions and communication, unquote, and, quote, share specialized infrastructure, labor, markets, and services, unquote. Under this definition, Commerce could support a cluster for anything from textile manufacturing to honeybee farming. You name it. Technically, based on this current definition, I don't see how any industry sector would be excluded from the program's eligibility. Finally, codifying the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship in Section 501 of Title V is simply not necessary. The office already exists. Additionally, the bill language directs the office to, quote, advocate policies, unquote. It is directing the Department of Commerce to, quote, advocate an appropriate executive branch activity. Is it? Well, it seems to be. At a time when we are experiencing over $1 trillion deficits, it just makes sense to hold off on starting new programs which are duplicative to existing programs and that will cost $250 million over 5 years for the loan guarantee program, and such sums, as it's stated in the bill, amount for the clusters program. I urge the committee to support this amendment that eliminates the Title V innovation so that we can help our country get back on a more solid financial ground. Our children and our grandchildren depend upon it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. And again, I respect your sincerity and your consistency here. Although this is a very broad amendment, striking the entire Title V, which I think has a number of good programs. I want to answer one thing that you did bring up is in the Department of Commerce, they've already established this Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. The reason that we're authorizing it is so that we can have authority for oversight. We wouldn't have authority otherwise. So I think that way you can keep an eye on them. Is there further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, you?
Yes. Yeah. Let me.
If this amendment does not succeed, which I expect it won't, just bearing the nature of what the amendment is all about, but could we, of course, I hope it does succeed because I think it makes sense. We've just got to stop the spending here in Congress, and this is creating new programs, new offices, new bureaucracy, new federal employees, and we've just got to stop the spending or halt the growth of government, and it's just critical. Would you accept my amendment if we could work together just to have the oversight of that already existing agency?
You know, I'm afraid I couldn't, Dr. Brown, because this is knocking out the entire Title V, and I think there are a variety of good proposals there. So I regret to say that I could not do that.
Would the chairman yield?
If he still has some time, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The point is, in Title V, these are duplicative programs. We already have the facility to do these things without having Title V, and that's the only reason to take that out. It is a big slash, I agree, but we need to be slashing government instead of growing government, and that's my whole purpose of this. We've got to stop the growth of government. We've got to stop the spending here in Washington, D.C., and that's the purpose, and so that's the reason I bring forth this amendment, and I think it just makes sense. Our American people are demanding less government, and I hope that members of the committee will support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. These really are, it's more of a coordination rather than duplication. That was the reason for that. But I think Mr. Lujan wanted to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while I appreciate the sentiments of making sure that we're being fiscally responsible at looking at programs, Mr. Chairman, I think that we also have to take into consideration the importance of how we can push technology out. As we look at evaluations that have come out of GAO, out of Sandia National Laboratories, out of the Department of Energy, and even other labs that have been interviewed, Mr. Chairman, we continue to hear that the lack of ability where we can encourage programs to bring people together, either through innovation hubs or through clusters. As we look at the innovation section of this legislation, to accelerate commercialization, manufacturing, areas where these ideas will be modeled after Bell Labs, the Manhattan Project Labs, and bioenergy research centers. I truly hope that these are ideas that we can look and work together, where I know that they've been supported by both sides of the aisle. And I know that Ranking Member Hall is fond of a former member from New Mexico, Manuel Lujan, that also served on this committee and served as its ranking member, who adopted and really supported and encouraged what we should be doing to look to support this side of activity as well, Mr. Chairman. So again, I just want to hope that we don't lose sight that we can help and accelerate on these sides, and I yield back my time.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Carnahan's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real briefly, I had heard specifically from our Missouri Enterprise program back that serves the St. Louis region and much of Missouri that asked me to speak up on this amendment because they believed that the innovation section truly enhances the competitive grant program that's been authorized. It adds another theme, reduction of energy usage and environmental waste to improve profitability and accelerate domestic commercialization of new product technologies to be considered by NIST and MEP when offering these competitive grants. And then in addition, the market demand analysis section will require NIST and MEP to verify that any product or service they require the centers to offer will be one that's relevant and needed by small and medium-sized manufacturing clients, which are certainly key in our region, and therefore I'd ask our colleagues respectfully to oppose the amendment.
Mr. Wu is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I very much respect Mr. Brown's passion and consistency on this set of issues. But with all due respect, I must, with equal passion and fervor, disagree and urge rejection of this amendment, because it is precisely this battle for the future and this battle for economic growth, and in essence, creating seed corn for future economic growth, that the creation of this section and this innovation agenda and lodging it at NIST, that's what this is all about. Let there be no mistake. The role of innovation in our society and our economy is absolutely essential. The vast majority of economists agree that more than 50% of American economic growth since World War II is the result of innovation. Not more labor, not more materials, but the way that labor and materials are blended together to produce products and services and jobs. Solow got a Nobel Prize for determining that from the 1890s to mid-century, 90% of American economic growth was because of innovation and innovative ideas. It is not just the creation of a lot of jobs from innovation, but it is precisely because it also creates high-wage, middle-class jobs, what we sorely need today. And centralizing some of these innovation ideas at NIST is entirely appropriate. NIST is a non-regulatory body. It is highly popular with the private sector. It has done a good job with the many other things that have been assigned to it, as Mr. Brown cited in its standards work, and it has thus far done a good piecework in innovation, and this section permits NIST to rationalize that process and bring the innovation agenda into focus in one place. We are here creating the seed corn for future economic growth. There is a lot of room to cut in the federal budget, but I submit to you that this is precisely the wrong place to cut it. And yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Rohrabacher is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Brown is right, and this is duplicative. We should not be spending money that is already being, that some other agencies and departments already have the responsibility. Duplication is a waste of money. I support Mr. Brown's amendment and would yield my time to him.
I thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher, for yielding me some time. I don't understand. I hear from my colleagues on the other side that we need innovation, and I agree. I'm not surprised that Mr. Lujan and Mr. Wu opposed the amendment, but I think most members of this committee understand that I believe in the Constitution as it was originally intended and think that we should only be doing the 18 things that Article 1, Section 8 gives us the authority to do and no more. That's what our Founding Fathers meant. NIST is one of those things that is truly constitutional, and I'm a strong supporter of NIST, and I'm a strong supporter of a very aggressive NIST, as well as I'm a strong supporter of research and development and scientific inquiry and all those things. But I don't understand how eliminating Title V is going to decrease innovation, how it's going to stop any promotion or advertising, and if the chairman or the subcommittee chairman would, I'd like to ask one or both of you to please explain to me how eliminating Title V would inhibit innovation, how it would inhibit the promotion or advertising. I just don't understand how that would happen. So I would yield to either or both for that answer.
Would you also yield to Mr. Peters? I think he would like to.
Well, to anybody who can answer how this is eliminating Title V, which is totally duplicative to other functions of the federal government. What we already have these things in place. Why add another one? If I'd like to hear somebody answer me, and I'd be glad to yield to anybody who can answer.
Mr. Peters is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's not directly to the question Mr. Brown is asking, but what happens with the elimination of Title V, there's a critical component of it that I'm very concerned about, and that's the elimination of the federal loan guarantees for manufacturing. It is, as a person who represents an awful lot of manufacturing companies, it is probably the #1 problem right now that manufacturers are facing because of the credit crisis that we're in. That they are not able to get the lending that they need in order to expand their manufacturing to move forward. As their collateral has dropped, they're finding that the commercial banks are simply not lending to them. They are in a position right now where they can create jobs right now, and yet they cannot get the liquidity necessary to go forward. It was certainly one of the #1 items brought forward to us by the National Association of Manufacturers. NAM testified to this component of it. In fact, it was Governor Engler, the former governor of my state, that was very strong in his testimony that federal loan guarantees are essential to manufacturing right now and essential to American competitiveness, and see this as a major problem with this amendment.
Well, I'm sorry to I need to reclaim my time, but
actually, Mr. Chairman, Mr.
Well, that
Chairman,
was,
I think I have the time.
wait, okay, that was Mr. Roebuck, okay.
If it's duplicative, it's duplicative. If there are other loan guarantee areas in the federal government, various departments and agencies, that's a major question that needs to be addressed, not just the validity of helping our manufacturers through loan guarantees. And I would then, again, yield back the 1 minute that I have left to Mr. Brown.
Well, thank you, Mr. Roebuck. I agree that manufacturing has some problems, but we already have, as Mr. Roebuck already said, as I said in my statement, we already have these programs. They're duplicative. Your manufacturing base can already get loans through SBA and through other entities. We've got to get the pressure off the small community banks so that they can lend money to small business and to manufacturing entities. And the federal government is busily closing small banks and is not able to loan money to your manufacturing entities as well as other small businesses. These programs are duplicative. They're totally unneeded, and that's the reason that I brought forth this amendment. And I think a vote for this is just a vote for growing the size of government and spending more and more money that we don't have. So I hope that y'all will reconsider. Let's stop these duplicative programs. Let's stop this language that is just so vague that anything could fit, and I encourage adoption of my amendment. I yield back. Thank you.
And the chairman yields to himself. Again, Dr. Brown raises legitimate questions, but I think they're off point in this. Yes, there are, and Mr. Roebuck, there are additional types of loan guarantee programs and bonding programs elsewhere, but they're for different purposes. And this one is specific. And let me, I want to read to you on page 70 under the coordination and non-duplication section. It says, coordination, non-duplication. To the maximum extent practicable, the Secretary shall ensure that the activities carried out under this section are coordinated with and do not duplicate the efforts of other loan guarantee programs within the federal government. So yes, SBA has some loan guarantee programs, but they wouldn't be for these type of manufacturing problems. So again, I sincerely hope that your concerns have been addressed by virtue of this, and I yield to you.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate that. But what's to prevent them from duplicating it? Because I see very little coordination within the federal government from one agency to another on anything. Well,
if I could regain,
yes, sir.
I mean, that's the mandate. They're mandated not to be to duplicate. So it's our committee's responsibility and oversight to make sure that occurs.
Well, I appreciate the chairman.
And I yield back. Sure.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I hope we will do that. But frankly, I have very little confidence in this federal government. I have very little confidence in one agency working with another to try to prevent duplication of any services, because we have never seen that happen, to my knowledge, and it's because each department, each agency wants to grow itself as much as possible. So I hope that this committee, in the chairman's absence in the future, and I also likewise have enjoyed serving with the chairman, and I'm going to miss you personally as a friend. And but I hope whoever's running this committee, hopefully it's going to be Mr. Hall in the next Congress, but hopefully we will keep. I hope we will keep their feet to the fire and not have duplication. I thank you, Chairman, for yielding.
Mr. Chairman, would you please take away the gentleman's pizza for that remark?
Let me just say that Mr. Hall is very flexible, so he may be the chairman of this committee in the future. You never know.
Yeah,
one way or the other.
The chairman is the ranking member willing to declare which party he's going to be in next year?
No, let's don't. So, Dr. Brown, I'm going to make you a present of this, and I'm not kidding, of this section here. So you will have it. Part of this committee responsibility next year should be oversight, and you can show where to go. So if there's no further discussion, the vote is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it. the amendment is not agreed to. Yes, Dr. Brown.
I request a recorded vote, please, sir.
The recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will record the vote.
Chairman
Call the roll.
Gordon.
No.
Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello.
Okay.
Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Fudge. Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Lujan. No. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mrs. Dahlkemper. Mrs. Dahlkemper votes no. Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson votes no. Ms. Cosmas. Ms. Cosmas votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Hall.
Aye.
Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Lucas. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Inglis votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Rothman.
Mr. Rothman votes no.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I vote no.
Ms. Giffords is not recorded.
Yeah, I vote no.
Ms. Giffords votes no.
Anyone else that hasn't been recorded? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 8 members vote aye and 25 members vote no.
The amendment is not passed. Before we move on to the next amendment, we're almost halfway through, and the chairman has been asked for mercy. And so in respect to the human beings here, we're going to take about a 20-minute break, which puts us back at 1 o'clock, and everyone is invited to the chairman's lounge for pizza and cold drinks.
Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Brown.
Dr. Baird withdrew my pizza permit. I asked unanimous consent that it be reinstated.
With unanimous consent,
I object.
Dr. Brown is allocated 1 piece.
Mr. Chairman, I object to anchovies.